So, Ismail, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here. And I've got a very trivial but very important question to start with, which is you're in Somaliland, and many of the people who are listening today and will join us on YouTube won't know the fine distinctions between Somalia and Somaliland. Could you just tell us the difference?
Yes, so Somaliland reclaimed its independence in 1991 after a war with the former regime in Somalia, Siad Barre. And for a bit of a history, I think Somaliland and Somalia joined in 1960. Somalia was Italian colony, Somaliland was a British colony, so the union has not really worked, and therefore Somalia reclaimed its independence in 1991 and has built something which is described as one of the most successful democracies in Africa, although it's not officially recognized country. It's it operates and has got everything that a state has, and including the internet we were talking about earlier today. Yeah. I live in London, but I'm glad to say that the internet I have in London, in Hargeisa, is far better than the Sky what I used to in London.
Well, thank you. And one of the things that people unfortunately will know about Somalia as a whole, as opposed to Somaliland, is that in international indices of corruption, Somalia appears very poorly. How does Somaliland compare to that broader picture?
I think it's one of the problems I think Somaliland faces is that when people hear the word Somali, I mean, yeah, it's not only the indices of corruption, but also the terrorism and so on. But if you look at really the whole region, Somaliland is considered to be one of the safest places in Africa. It's, you know, people do businesses here, and there's no separate index for corruption, but definitely I would say Somaliland would be on par with countries like Rwanda. I think the challenge Somaliland faces is that we have a huge aid industry based in Mogadishu that wastes billions of dollars, doesn't really support, probably contributes to the problems we have even so in Somalia. So the aid industry paints a picture where the whole region, not only Somalia, is invested, as terrorism, corruption, and so on. But the reality is really different. And unfortunately, the media kind of like show simple stories. Hey, there's terrorism, corruption, failed state, and so on. And that's what we often hear. But the reality in Somaliland is quite different.
So this distinction between Somaliland and Somalia is actually quite important, both as it's potentially a separate state, Somaliland, but also it is quite distinctively different in cultural terms, but also in terms of some of those development indicators.
I think definitely for the last 30 years, Somaliland has been a functioning state, which has conducted elections. I think the last one was very recently completed. Very recently municipal and parliamentary elections, which were free and fair, where the government actually lost control of the parliament, but still the government accepted that without any interference. So I think there's a problem, I think, not only in Somaliland, but across Africa, the kind of a negative image, a stereotype is kind of so where the media kind of focus on what goes wrong rather than reporting the successes we often see. And Somaliland is a success case, a country which does not receive any meaningful aid from, because it's not a member of the UN, or for that matter, cannot borrow from the IMF or the World Bank, but still it does. It's a very successful, it's comparable to some of the democratic countries in Africa.
And you came from Somaliland to the UK in the 1980s and then did a very impressive string of degrees at the best universities. and then came to Sussex to do some research. Why did you choose Sussex?
Well, I actually had my relationship with Sussex goes back to when I was doing my PhD. I was a research assistant at the IDS, and I really liked Brighton and the Institute. So, and even when I was doing my PhD on food security, I used the IDS library, which is one of the best in development, definitely. So that was really my first connection with IDS, and then subsequently, I think in 1997, I joined a research program on post-war reconstruction in the Greater Horn of Africa, which was financed by DFID. That was when I then moved and settled in Brighton, and that was really the project which led me to do one of the first primary research work on remittances in the Horn of Africa, where Somaliland was a case study. So that was really, and that was what ultimately led me to work at the UN Remittance Program.
And just to be clear, most people will know what remittances is and the importance of remittances, but remittances is money sent home by people who are from a country now living abroad in the diaspora, or maybe second generation overseas. And your research really showed how incredibly important that amount of money was. It had previously been a bit neglected in the literature. Am I right in that?
Absolutely. I think in the case of, I think we use Somalia as a case study again. So at the time, the UN estimates at the time was that Somaliland was receiving a few $1 million a year. The primary research we conducted, which was based on household surveys and data we gathered from the money transfer companies that send money to the Horn of Africa, came up with a figure of $500 million to Somaliland alone. Obviously, the aid industry, which claimed that they were the ones who were critical for the livelihoods of people in the region, disputed the figures and said these were not, said these were not true. Interestingly, and that figure today, when we have hard data collected by the Central Bank of Somaliland, is 1.3 billion last year in Somaliland. So, of course, it was a lot of the remittances were largely informal in the early days, but there were surveys that were confirming the importance of remittance and the size, and when one of the largest money transfer companies was shut down by the U.S. authorities for alleged links to terrorism, UN agencies saw the opportunity for them to use that as to fundraise. So it was the same team that wrote to me when I was at IDS that claimed that my figure of 500 million was or disputed that figure, claimed that after the Al Barakat, or the largest money transfer company, was shut down, claimed that the remittances also, to the region were more than $1 billion. Although in my case, I think I said only a small portion of that went through money transfer companies. A big chunk of the time were hand-carried cash. People were there going back to the country, taking cash back home, or using trade-based remittances, means people investing the money to buy construction material, food, clothes, and then importing back into the country. Whereas the UN estimate claimed that the bulk of that money was going through the company that was shut down. So, but quite a huge flows of remittances to Africa. It's still the estimates we have, and there's slightly better data today than, say, in the late 1990s. It's still the figure is far bigger than what we hear from the World Bank and so on.
So I have to say, you're already in what you're saying not sounding very positive about the UN. But you then went to work for the UN, and tell us the story about you working at the UN. What did you do and how did it end?
So I've been involved even before I joined the UN. I had, in addition to the research work I had done, I became a consultant for some of the money transfer companies. And in fact, I had I set up one of the first money transfer services between UK and the Horn of Africa in the early 90s. So only a few years after I arrived in the UK. And so I've always been quite passionate about remittances. So after that research work at Sussex, IDS, the UN set up a remittance initiative intended to or able to help the remaining money transfer companies to comply with new regulations introduced after 9/11. So that was one after the largest East African money transfer company known as Al Barakat was shut down. So the UN officials approached me while I was in London, and because of the my interest in research work and remittances, they were looking for someone who was trusted by the industry, so had some knowledge of the industry to help them. Companies accept a platform that the UN was building for them to help them comply with the money transfer regulations. It was a very high-profile program, because the program we're talking to regulators in the US, in Europe, Australia, and so on. So, and it was probably the last project you would expect that to be fraud, to have anything to do with fraud or corruption, kind of. So it was in the media. And so that's how I joined the UN program. I lived in London at the time, but the program was based in Nairobi. So I left my family, went to Nairobi. And within a few weeks of joining, starting the work, I saw evidence of widespread fraud and corruption involving senior UNDP officials and consultants that work for the UN.
And what sort of form did the corruption take? In our course, we spend a lot of time trying to define different types of corruption and seeing what form it takes. So what were you experiencing?
So what I saw was the activities of the project, or the project's, the feasibility study of the project, the original proposal of the project, a lot of those were those came from KPMG consultants, who were the initial consultants hired by UNDP to help them and say, how can we help this industry? So I think it's worth going back to a bit of history. KPMG were auditors for the UNDP program, UNDP Somalia, based in Nairobi. And then, so the auditors were then awarded this, they may have different departments, but it was the same, KPMG East Africa, were awarded to come up with a proposal that can be used to raise money for the program. And then the first thing I saw was that the consultant who put together the proposal, who was awarded almost all the projects, or including the feasibility study, was the lead consultant, became the head of the technical officer of the program. So that was the first thing I said, okay, and I know the issue of the conflict of interest issue and so on. And then I was able to see that there were no bidding involved, there were rigging, all the issues, and the fact that the project was only producing paperwork, but there was no evidence of anything that has been implemented. I think probably the best example I saw was a feasibility study, which is still even today online, where 85% of the work was plagiarized. Somebody, which was spent a fortune. Somebody went to, probably overnight, to download an IMF paper, UN works on remittances, and without any citation, just reproduced. There was I think, something like 6-7 pages where they only replaced one word. So something of that nature. So that's what, when I saw those, I thought hard and say, okay, so what should I do? And I weighed the kind of the risks of should I, whether I should turn a blind eye like everybody else. This was why everybody knew at the UNDP office at the time what was going on. They knew that the person who was a consultant joined without the position being advertised. It was a very senior position. They knew that only one firm won all the award, the contracts. They knew that the plagiarized report was online, so everybody saw that kind of stuff. And in fact, one of the marriage transfer companies complained and said that this was downloaded from the internet and then added to the UNDP work. And they said, oh, we forgot citations, we'll kind of amend. So I thought and say, okay, everybody knows this, should I turn the blind eye like everywhere else and see what I can do for the industry? Because I think my goal was, say, this is an industry which provides livelihoods to billions of people. And I thought maybe the best way you could do something about it later, but should you proceed? I think a key consideration also for me was my own personal safety. I think the induction I received in Nairobi was, be careful. So, and I think that is a consideration for a lot of employees who work at the UN in a place like Nairobi. But after a couple of sleepless nights, I decided to do something about it. So I, on a bright sunny day, and I still remember it was 19 February 2006, I went to an internet cafe close to where I live in West Nairobi, Sarit Center. And when you're doing something like this, of course, I mean, you suspect everybody. So initially I decided to do this anonymously. So it was after oil for food scandal, the UN. So a few weeks before that, I received an email from, which was circulated to all UN staff from Kofi Annan saying that from now onwards, there will be zero tolerance to corruption. He set up, Kofi Annan set up the UN the hotline for and also the UN whistleblower protection program was set up at the time. So that was quite encouraging. And I thought, hey, I think the UN is after all serious about tackling corruption. So initially I thought that the anonymous disclosure would be enough because it was obvious. All those contracts, I did nothing else but list all the contracts that were awarded to KPMG. I mentioned that the fact that the KPMG were also auditors of UNDP. And so I also sent the link of the plagiarized, which was one of the examples report. There was feasibility study to set up a central bank for Somalia, which again was based on a plagiarized report from what Kenya does, basically, without acknowledgement. So that was enough to, I thought, to do something about this. And because of course, I pretended that this was somebody else. So of course, changed my style of writing, and so sent the email, and then 2 days, immediately the UNDP Nairobi or New York sent a team of investigators to Nairobi. And I was quite glad when I saw a team that immediately came. So they did take it very seriously. I think they arrived, that was Sunday, probably they arrived on Tuesday morning. So I was quite pleased. But immediately I realized that the team was sent to help senior management cover up fraud rather than do an investigation. So they had a copy of my anonymous disclosure. My colleagues or senior team at UNDP did not suspect me because this guy who came from the diaspora, they thought, I think they didn't know my history and so on. I used to write about corruption in the past, but they missed that part kind of. So they thought that I wouldn't be interested in this stuff. So they came to me and said, they explained to me what was happening, and they said they suspected the industry. So they said somebody has sent an email to New York could you help us and tell us, identify this person? I said, of course, more than glad to help you identify. Share me the email. So then they forwarded me the email I sent to New York. And then I said, yeah, I think it looks like it came from outside, probably the media or maybe the industry council. And in a way, that was what helped me to get a lot of some further hard evidence. Because they told me, they said, look, we want to get access to all the documents related to this program. Going back to 2002, when they issued the first announcement saying that the world has to help this industry, otherwise millions of people will starve. And I said, okay, I'm happy to do that. And they know I did some research. So yeah, so they said, okay, I think you're a good researcher. So why don't you help us get all the documents? I said, I'm glad, I'm more than happy to do that as well. So they asked the IT department to give me access to files related, all the files to this program. I think that the files they were referring to were mostly the paperwork related to KPMG contracts. I think the IT department made a mistake and they gave me admin rights for almost all the emails, not just the folders containing these. So I had access to data files, Outlook data files, which contained more or less the entire correspondence going back to 2002, including emails that were openly talking about how they can defraud the program. And so I was able to download all of those. There were thousands of emails. Took them home. And once the initial whistleblowing failed, the kind of anonymous disclosure failed, I was able to put together a detailed dossier where, based on the new hard evidence emails, I was able to read over a long period of time. So that was February. I managed to complete the initial work by October, I think it's sort of second week of October. So at that stage, I produced a very detailed dossier with all the efforts. I probably spent a lot of time. I used to work day and night. And obviously, since I went to that internet cafe in Nairobi, I imposed myself just to don't care for you because of safety and so on. So I used the time to kind of a write-up. Similar to the kind of a lockdown. I did experience a lockdown similar to what we have today at the time. So, and then they decided because of that, they suspected the industry was complaining and so on. And so they decided to transfer me to Dubai and said, okay, why don't you get closer to the industry, set up a base in Dubai? And I said, yeah, I'm more than happy to do that. And so on the day when I was about to leave Nairobi, I think it was the 19th of October again, 2006, I was able to submit the new dossier to my boss as the UNDP guideline is set at the time. So in an email and a hard folder, a thick folder.
And this time it wasn't anonymous. This time you were doing it in
this
your
time.
own
No, this time it was saying, I referred to UNDP guidelines and I said, okay, this is what I think. This needs to be investigated, and here's the evidence of a widespread fraud and corruption. And my boss was quite shocked. I said, okay, I'll have a look at it. Look at them. But then, and then as soon as I submitted, I booked a taxi. I used to, a taxi. Went to the airport. The flight was midnight. The flight to London. I was flying via London, sort of. But I went there around 3 p.m. So it just, as soon as I submitted, because of fear of my own safety and so on. So then my boss, when I went to Dubai, Dubai is suddenly safe, so I was no longer worried about anything. So my boss flew to Dubai. We met at a hotel. He told me that he had read the dossier I shared with him. And he told me, he said, look, this is the UN. I mean, this is your first job at the UN. this is not how the UN works. Now I understand what has happened. He advised me and said, look, you've got a good CV. I know you're passionate about this industry, but I tell you, don't do this stuff. Withdraw those files. We will transfer the remaining funds to an industry association that was set up at the time. So use that money to whatever, buy the platform you were talking about and so on for the industry, but don't do this stuff. And it's a personal advice. And I said, no, I said, if you don't investigate this, if you don't take it this seriously, I will, as the guidelines say, send this to the UNDP administrator in New York. And if they don't do anything, the guidelines require, allow me to go public. And I said, that's what I'm going to do. And he said, no, if you don't withdraw with this, he said, I won't be able to, he said, you lose your job and I won't be able to work in the industry again. So he said, think again. And I said, okay, see you then. And that's what happened. And so my contract was ended immediately. I had other issues. They suspended my payments, so including for my salary. And so that was the kind of the height of the financial crisis. So at the time, so I became not only unemployed but unemployable, because if you fight with the UN, you don't. And he told me, I think my boss told me, forget about the UNDP and the remittance. You would find difficulty in getting a job in development. I said, okay, let's see. So I came back to London, and then I updated my dossier to include the complaint of retaliation at that time, and submitted to UNDP administrator. That's what our guidelines require us. So, and also send it to the UN Ethics Committee, which was established at the time. Initially, they said, this is very serious when they read the dossier, and they said they will get to the bottom of this. But instead of doing that, they appointed somebody they thought would help fight the case on UNDP's behalf. And so after maybe 6-7 months, I think there's a period where if they don't do anything, they didn't do anything for quite a period of time. So then I decided to go public. So actually went to Reuters, and Reuters published my story at the time. I was fortunate. I got support from a whistleblower organization in Washington. It's called known as GAP. So I think their advice was quite crucial. So in terms of the fighting through the UN justice system and so on. And so as soon as we went public, the UNDP took it slightly more seriously, as they said. They promised to the media that they will now send a team to Nairobi to get to the bottom of what was happening there. But they never did it. In fact, all they did was they went to some employees, some industry members, who they threatened and said that, look, if you support this guy, you will have issues. So many of the industry operators then provided false statements claiming that this guy is a troublemaker. And the UNDP Ethics Committee initially based their decision not on the hard evidence I submitted, but on some witness statements saying that the project was helped them and so on. And so initially, UN Ethics Committee said that they weren't able to see any retaliation and even fraud for that matter. And so that allowed us to go then to the UN Ethics Committee, which was headed by a credible lawyer, Canadian lawyer. I think the UNDP Ethics Committee relied on the same investigators who initially supported, helped cover up the corruption. So the GAP and everybody I talked to told us that the UNDP had no credible system. So we're only waiting for us for them to give us a decision, and so we could go to the UN Ethics Committee. So, and at that stage, the dossier I put together was probably more than 1,000 pages. It was the 4th year of the case, and I probably spent more time on this than my PhD. So that's the kind of amount of work involved. And so when the UN Ethics Committee reviewed my dossier, they were quite surprised how how the UNDP kind of dealt with the case, and so they upheld my case, and I became probably one of the first UNDP whistleblowers to win the case, and I was awarded compensation for losing my job for the retaliations I suffered, and if before that they were able to kind of even release my salaries and other funds they've withheld while I was going through the case. And so that was why, after I decided the only way I could go back to the industry was to set up my own money transfer company, and it was quite timely. So when I won the case, I received the compensation exactly on the 4th anniversary of the day when I went to the internet cafe in Nairobi. And it became the initial seed money for WorldRemit. And one of the first things I did when I won the case was to write to my former boss, who was promoted to head the Haiti humanitarian relief program during the earthquake. So he was managing about $1 billion. So I wrote to him to tell him that, yeah, I was back, kind of. So when I started my business, and so that was the that was the end of the case. But it was, but given the confidentiality of the UN, I think obviously. I went again public with this story, and Reuters wrote about the fact that I won my case, and that the official who was responsible, particularly for the retaliation, was promoted. So the UNDP then quietly removed him from his position, and I think that was kind of their reaction. But I think so I think that was the kind of the my story with the UNDP. At the time.
Well, that is an absolutely amazing story, and partly it's amazing because I see you there smiling and successful, and so many people who have been through a whistleblowing experience have a very negative experience because they find lots of the things that you found. The organization, instead of investigating the wrongdoing, investigates the whistleblower. That there are attempts to discredit the whistleblower. The organization closes in on itself and tries to protect itself rather than uncover the wrongdoing. But what's remarkable about your story is that you were able to go through that and still have the energy and the optimism to start your own business. How did you deal with that psychologically? I mean, what was your frame of mind?
Well, I think, yes, and that's really key. I think the strength of the evidence I have gathered kind of forced me to say, look, I have to get to the bottom of this. So that's one. I think when you start a case like this one, I think you have to be, you need optimism in the face of adversity. I think you need also a level of perseverance and persistence to go through some of these things. Because I remember when I spoke to lawyers before I found GAP, one of the, I think a lawyer who worked with a UNDP whistleblower told me, and said, look, when I said, oh, this was a case in Dubai, in Nairobi and so on, he said I had a better chance of winning the lottery than than winning this case through the UN. So I think despite that, I thought the strength of the evidence I've gathered, the 1,000-page dossier, and I think what was very helpful to me was also the what Kofi Annan introduced at the time, which was the guidelines that allowed me to call public if the UNDP, if UN agency failed to investigate. I think that was the key. I think it was the support I received from the whistleblower organization. So I think all of these things together helped me to still persist. And also the industry, this was something I've been deeply involved in. So I've been quite passionate. And I said, look, if they, I was shocked. I was surprised that approaching the program that was, a very high profile we were talking to regulators. This was a program that was itself aimed to help companies fight with fraud, corruption, money laundering, and that was itself corrupt. I said, I think it was all of those things that came together that forced me to persist and continue. And in a way, why I started the business was, of course, I had some experience of the money transfer. I've also seen the costs and inconvenience of sending money back home, when I was a student. So, of course, I had also that experience. And a part of the reason why I've always been quite passionate about remittances. So I think so I thought that the only way I could go back to something I've always been liked to do was to set up my own business. And in a way, perhaps the success of what I set up, I think my experience at the UN probably played a part because I had burned my bridge and I had nothing else to go back to, So perhaps I think that itself was part of what we had to build in the early days, because I started the business in the very early days of industry moving to online, and money transfer industry was one of the last to move to online. So it was quite challenging. And I remember in the early days, I used to do 80 hours plus, it was quite challenging. Our first corridor was Somaliland. So even convincing not only regulators, but also investors that, it was safe to send money transfers to the Horn of Africa was itself a challenge. So I think it was all of these things that I thought helped me to stay sane and then do something.
I'd like to invite everyone who's listening, if they'd like to ask a question, to put them in the chat, and then I'll pick out one or two to ask in a moment. But Ismail, you were talking there for a bit about motivations, and clearly when you were an anonymous whistleblower in the internet cafe in Nairobi, there could have been no sense that either your salary would have been stopped or you would have had financial compensation for that. At any stage in this, was there any kind of financial motivation for you? And do you think that financially rewarding whistleblowers is a good or a bad thing?
No, I never expected to get anything out of this, the reality. In fact, I was scared to tell you the truth, because in Nairobi, I heard a lot of stories, people, getting involved in the car crash and so on. Yeah, so because it wasn't only the senior officials or the high-profile consultants, KPMG, but there were many other people involved in this who were beneficiaries of the corruption. So I think. And I was new to Nairobi, so so I didn't know the environment, the setting, who was involved, who was protecting who. So I think and the more and in fact the information I was able to unearth when I was searching, when I read the emails, only made me a bit more scared and paranoid. So for me, I thought I was taking a personal risk rather. Forget about the compensation at the time. But I thought that if I had to do, and I think it's also worth mentioning, there were some employees, local, Somali employees in Nairobi, who saw this one, who actually I trusted. So they, even after my contract was ended, they used to provide me some key intelligence. And they decided, of course, they still remain at the UN, and some of them continue to work for the UN, so they have to remain anonymous. But I felt the advantage I had was at least I could go back to London. Originally my plan was to relocate my family to Nairobi, but I decided against that. And in fact, even in Nairobi, before I went to the internet cafe, I moved to probably one of the only few UN-approved kind of flats which had armed protection. Some of the senior officials used to live there. So my entire salary used to go to pay for that, for that, the apartment. So I think that was I think, but what I was researching, this was something I learned, I think, particularly from the US, was that the compensation, particularly in the private sector, where whistleblowers become rich if they get it right. I think as an incentive, it's important. I do support that idea because I think nobody will get rich of the 1 year salary from the UN, obviously, given what I went through. But in the private sector, you have, there should be, I think, incentive for some of the employees, and even for the UN. I think, typically, the best you could get a 1 year salary, which was in my case. At least I was an international staff, but some of the local Somali staff in Nairobi were paid, $1,000. So if they lose their job, who can guarantee their security? But if they receive a year's salary, what is that worth? So obviously, I think some meaningful compensation definitely might help some people to at least change their career or whatever. So I think I believe it's important.
Great, thank you, and thank you for your very insightful and honest approach to these questions. I've got a great question here in the chat from Umtabizi, who's one of our students on the master's course, who says, I'll read it out. Being a whistleblower yourself, what have you done differently within WorldRemit to create an organizational culture that encourages reporting of wrongdoing and protection of whistleblowers? So have you managed to translate your own experiences into your new environment?
I would claim I practice what I preach. And in a way, part of the reason why I tell my story is to encourage others to do the same. And I think, and during the early days of WorldRemit, I think it was a big company now, we had a lot of correspondence in Africa, payout partners, banks, government entities. Some banks are owned by governments and so on. So I think the approach I took, the approach of talking publicly about the costs of corruption, and I used to write about corruption, particularly in Somaliland, even before the UNDP. I think I wouldn't have probably got the job had they seen some of the stuff I used to write in the past. So I think definitely helped that. So as much as I could do, definitely I have share what I've learned internally in terms of particularly remaining very open. So because openness matters. I think what was the most difficult challenge I saw the UN was the using confidentiality to cover up fraud and corruption, using confidentiality to avoid accountability. So I think one of the first things we did with WorldRemit was that we've always been very open, transparent. And my staff, I think some of the feedback I received was probably I share more information than I should. And I have no issue with that. So if you go to a company's house, you will see that we were probably the only, money transfer business, or probably, that reported revenues from year one, when our revenues were only £80,000. That was minuscule compared to what we're doing now. So companies wait until they become public, particularly startups, because they love to brag about how well they're doing and so on. We were very open. I said, look, why do we have to hide what we're doing? So I think I felt that particular transparency, openness, which encourage people to then give you feedback, and if you get things wrong, you have a chance to self-correct, So I did as much as I could. Yes.
Great. And you just mentioned that you were minuscule when your revenues were £80,000. Give us an idea now, 10, 12, 15 years on, how big are you? What are your revenues? How big are you compared to any other money transfer companies?
I think we publish Companies House. If you go to Companies House today, you will see the latest figures we've put up. I think we're one of the largest now. I mean, a year ago, last year, we acquired another money transfer business, which is particularly focused on Africa, Sendwave. So the combined entities are quite large. So we're one of the largest players now, particularly in Africa, because WorldRemit had already been big in Africa, but then when you add to Sendwave, I think we're a global business, but we're quite big in Africa. So very, very public, So.
This is an absolutely amazing story, I have to say. Not just, it's a story of entrepreneurialism, which in its own self is just fascinating. And entrepreneurialism around, sort of ethics and sustainability, trying to build a company that does real good in the world. But actually, the most amazing thing is that it comes from this history of you being a whistleblower and before then being an academic. I mean, it's just, an extraordinary set of sequence of events. One of the comments in the chat from Ewan Grant is he highlights your bravery, and you've talked a bit about security, and I think we all appreciate how incredibly brave whistleblowers are, and you have been. He also asked, did anybody in the UN say sorry to you, and what happened to the senior people?
No, so far. So what happened to senior people? Apart from the official who was at Haiti, who was removed from that position, no one else was. Everybody else still staying in the system, kind of. So the UN system, I think they said the organization was responsible, but there was no accountability for the individuals who gained from the corruption and fraud. So, and that's why I'm still very critical of the whole UN system, of the way the UN system works, because there should have been individual accountability for, for what has happened. And still the evidence is out there. So some of them moved to other UN agencies and so on. And there has been a story of even one of the key architects of this who would have been alleged to have done corruption elsewhere, kind of. So I think that part's quite sad.
And again, a classic in cases both of corruption and of whistleblowing, that the person who is persecuted is the whistleblower, and actually the people who did the wrongdoing, committed the crimes, seem to escape, even if the whistleblower is vindicated. There's another question from Graham Baxter about the UNDP system today. Do you think that a whistleblower in the UNDP system would encounter the same things today, or would they be able to pursue this within the system, or should they also go to journalists and seek publicity?
Well, I think I haven't seen the updated whistleblower procedures, but at the time, whistleblowers were allowed to go public if the UNDP fails to investigate the case. I think the problem is that they would claim that they're looking into this and then buy time, so until everything is moves and so on. From what I am hearing, I don't believe things have changed. I think people are smarter now, so they would not leave the kind of audit trail, the kind of emails I was able to access. So from what I understand, it's a lot harder now to capture because they're aware of the social media now and so on, stuff going to. So I wouldn't have probably waited, the time, if I had access to social media, kind of, so I would have anonymously put this on the social media. So I think it's a lot harder to get the kind of evidence you need. But from what I see, no, nothing has changed as far as I can see. And the classic, and again, this was a UNDP Somalia. I believe far worse fraud and corruption today takes place in Mogadishu. Billions of dollars are wasted a year by the international agencies, the aid industry in Mogadishu. And I believe that is only contributing to the problem Somalia has.
And it's worthwhile drawing out just one other thing you said about the fact that by mistake the IT department gave you access to all that information. And amazing that, you know, this to some extent would not have happened if it hadn't been for them making a fundamental mistake like that. You wouldn't have been able to compile such a detailed dossier, your PhD-sized dossier.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, all I had, I didn't know which individual is how they kind of a bit rigging. I mean, the elaborate email is saying that, okay, if this, organization submits a bid, let's do this. And then if they, I couldn't believe, I mean, the way they were engineering things kind of so smart. So capturing that, and the people have been copied to kind of so. I think that was quite incredible. But even in that case, I think this is the problem. Yeah. So even in a situation where you had that incontrovertible evidence, no one was held accountable, apart from kind of slightly covering up and asking that person to vacate, leave that position. And even they did that because the media were asking questions and saying that, well, how could somebody who has been alleged to have done this, and the UN Ethics Committee has upheld the complaint, could it still be managing that? It was kind of superficial to kind of kill the story, but there was been no meaningful reform per se, kind of so. And I think, and that's still the sad reality of the UN system so far.
There are some more excellent questions in the chat. We won't get to all of them. Jackman, I apologize, we can't get to yours because I think it's such an interesting question. The answer would take too long. But I do want to pick up on what Jay Monk has said here, which is it ever possible to ensure that a money transfer service is relatively free from money laundering?
No, it is a good question. No, I think if you look at how somebody is still transferring dirty money, I think, but I would say the companies that are doing this online are doing far better job than the traditional money transfer companies, because today, if you look at the company like WorldRemit, the amount of data we capture allows us to detect, somebody who is kind of a laundering funds and so on. And often and I think it's also worth pointing out a lot of the money launderers typically use banks, because if you look at the average transaction size of a company like WorldRemit, we're talking about very small amounts, an average of $100, $150. So these are really smaller amounts. Somebody doing money laundering, somebody who's laundering funds stolen, from an agency would typically need a bank. Somebody who's paying for a inflated contract or a bogus contract, as was the case with one of the UNDP contracts, would need a bank to process that rather than a money transfer company. So I think, yeah, so they're still, I think, if you look at the cross-border transfers, I think the regulators would claim that a large part, which is largely conducted by the banks, is still involved in the money laundering. So the unfortunate reality is that a lot of the money transfer, anti-money laundering regulations introduced after 9/11 penalized the individuals sending tiny amounts. And a lot of our customers get really frustrated when we ask too many questions for someone who's been regularly sending a tiny amount. But those don't really capture the big guys who are wiring $500,000, millions of dollars and so on. That is still, and the offshores and so on, yeah.
This is something we hear often about the global anti-money laundering system, that it provides huge inconvenience for people who are very low risk and allows the people who are very high risk to sail through the system. And I believe, Ismail, you've already also personally had some interesting experiences with ID checks on yourself.
Yeah, and I'm one of the angry customers who have always had a lot of friction when I send money not only through my FNO company, but also others. I use Western Union, and I had same issues in the past because I happen to share both of my names, Ismail Ahmed, with the former spiritual leader of the Palestinian group Hamas, Ahmed Ismail. So the screening software typically will, say that this is 100% match. In other words, I'm the person who is on the UN sanctions list, despite the fact that the Sheikh Ahmed Ismail was killed by Israel, I think 2004. He was on a wheelchair. He had never left, I think, Gaza and so on. But the nature of the way screening software works, that it matches the names, and typically the data captured or added to the US OFAC list, screening, the sanction list is so poor. That's all you have sometimes, and then therefore I have to prove that I'm not the former spiritual leader of Hamas, kind of. So, and Americans, particularly the Treasury Department, decided to keep his name on the sanction list, just in case, kind of. So, in fact, I wrote to them and the BBC once when they were looking into this issue, the friction and the inconvenience caused by the people being added just to the sanction list. Asked the head of OFAC and said, you have names like mine, why don't you remove and clean the database so that people like myself don't kind of experience that issue? So, but it's still a big issue. And I apologize to our customers often when people write to me and say, look, my name is Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali is a common name. So you have on sanction list the name of Muhammad Ali. There is no other details. We don't know who Muhammad Ali was. We don't know which country, what was the date of birth, and so on. So anyone who is called Muhammad Ali could potentially be that person. So you have to go to elaborate length and ask the customer, say, okay, get me your photo ID. What have you been doing, so on. Just to say, I think there is probably enough evidence to say, this is not that person. You look at the date that was added to the sanctions and say, maybe this guy wasn't born, or maybe at the time or something. So the database have never been cleaned, particularly in the case of OFAC, which is the main US Treasury sanctions. Yeah.
Ismail, thank you for that. I'm conscious we're out of time. I want to ask you one final question, which you could answer in just a few seconds. What's your best memory of being at Sussex?
Oh, the beach. And I still go back to Brighton. Yeah. So anytime I need to walk along and kind of think about something, yeah, definitely. Brighton Beach. It's probably one of the best.
Great.
I go back at least, every year? Yes.
It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, Ismail. Thank you so much. We all admire your courage and how you have moved your life into this huge success despite the whistleblowing. And thank you for the whistleblowing, which was on behalf of all of us as citizens of the world. It's been really great talking to you. Thank you so much. And we'll conclude it there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ismail.